Rome was no stranger to blood and death. But one emperor took cruelty further than anyone dared. He didn't just execute his enemies, he made them suffer in ways beyond imagination. A pot, a flame, and a rat became his instruments of power. This is the nightmare of Domitian, Rome's cruelest tyrant. The streets of Rome glitter with marble and gold, but beneath the grand arches and triumphal columns, whispers travel faster than the river Tiber. Rome, at the turn of the 1st century, was an empire at its peak, rich, vast, and unstoppable. Yet behind the facade of strength and splendor stood a ruler whose cruelty struck deeper than any sword. His name was Domitian, the emperor who ruled Rome with a hand of iron and a mind clouded by paranoia. Domitian was the son of Emperor Vespasian and the younger brother of Titus. Unlike his father and brother, who were celebrated for victories and stability, Domitian carried a darker reputation. Where others sought glory on the battlefield or honor in the Senate, he sought control absolute, unquestioned, and eternal. To him, Rome was not just an empire. It was an extension of his will, but his will was cruel. Domitian saw enemies everywhere, in the Senate, among his generals, even within his own household. Betrayal was his obsession, and he believed fear was the surest guard against treachery. While emperors before him had employed executions and exile, Domitian went further. He demanded punishments that would not only kill but also terrify. He wanted methods that would break the soul before the body perished. Among these punishments, one stood above all in horror: the rat torture. To understand why Domitian chose such a grotesque method, one must understand Rome itself. The empire was no stranger to cruelty. Gladiators fought to the death for sport. Slaves were crucified along roads as warnings. Enemies were burned alive, thrown to beasts, or drowned in the Tiber. Violence was not just punishment, it was spectacle. But even in such a brutal society, there were levels of cruelty considered excessive, things that whispered in back alleys, but rarely spoken in courts. Rat torture was one of them. Its origins are murky, believed to have been whispered from the provinces in the east, perhaps borrowed from older empires. But under Domitian, it was perfected. The method was terrifyingly simple. A live rat was placed inside a clay pot, the open end fastened against the victim's bare body, often the abdomen. Heat would then be applied to the pot, forcing the frantic animal to seek escape. With nowhere to go but inward, the rat clawed and chewed through the only path available, the flesh of the victim. It was not quick. It was not merciful. It was slow, savage, and filled with screams that echoed long after the victim was gone. Domitian reserved this punishment for those he deemed traitors or conspirators. Sometimes senators, sometimes slaves, sometimes even friends who had outlived their usefulness. Domitian's reign was marked by paranoia. He trusted no one, not even the Senate he ruled. He demanded to be addressed as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God, and expected loyalty not only in action but in thought. Whispers of rebellion reached him daily, whether true or fabricated. To silence dissent, he relied on spies and informants. Those accused of disloyalty often faced the rat torture, not always because they were guilty, but because their suffering served as a warning to others. In Domitian's mind, terror was a stronger shield than law. One account tells of a senator accused of plotting against him. Brought before the emperor, the man pleaded innocence. But Domitian's cold eyes did not waver. A clay pot was fetched, a rat shoved inside. As the senator was strapped down, Domitian himself is said to have given the order to light the coals beneath the pot. The senator's screams filled the chamber, but Domitian did not flinch. To him, this was not cruelty. It was order. Word of such punishment spread quickly. Senators grew quieter in their debates, unwilling to risk offense. Generals who once boasted of their victories now spoke with measured words. Even the common people, who loved spectacle, whispered fearfully of the emperor's cruelty. But Rome was trapped. For all his paranoia and brutality, Domitian was an efficient ruler. He reformed the economy, strengthened the frontiers, and kept order in the capital. The people may have feared him, but they also relied on him. Rome was stable under his hand, even if that hand dripped with blood. And so, the city carried on, its streets filled with commerce and its temples with prayers, even as shadows of torture lingered in the emperor's palaces. Yet fear cannot hold an empire forever. In secret, hatred grew. Senators who had lost friends to Domitian's cruelty plotted quietly. Soldiers who once adored their emperor began to resent his mistrust. Even members of his own court began to whisper. The rat torture, grotesque as it was, became more than just punishment. It became a symbol of Domitian's tyranny. It showed Rome not just that he could kill, but that he delighted in breaking men piece by piece. And when rulers become monsters in the eyes of their people, rebellion is never far behind. The palace chamber was silent, except for the crackling of torches mounted along the marble walls. Shadows danced across the gilded ceiling, and a cold breeze drifted through the half-open windows overlooking the Palatine Hill. In the center of the room lay a wooden platform, stained dark from the torments of countless victims. Here, under the watchful gaze of Emperor Domitian, one of Rome's cruelest punishments was performed. The accused, whether guilty of treason or merely inconvenient, was dragged before the emperor. Shackles clinked against the stone floor as soldiers forced the prisoner down. The ritual of Domitian's cruelty was always deliberate, for in his mind, terror worked best when it was witnessed, and witness it they did. Senators, guards, and palace officials stood in tense silence, their eyes darting between the condemned man and the emperor, who sat upon a high-backed chair, expressionless. The instrument of torture was deceptively simple, a clay or metal pot, wide at the base, narrowing at the mouth. Inside, a large rat squirmed, its claws scratching desperately against the walls. The animal smelled of filth and panic. To the victim, that smell was the scent of death. The prisoner was bound tightly, most often with his bare stomach exposed. A soldier pressed the mouth of the pot firmly against the man's abdomen, securing it with straps so there was no escape for the creature inside. Then came the fire. Coals were placed at the base of the pot, or in some cases, a torch was held close enough to heat the clay. The air inside grew hotter and hotter. The rat squealed in distress, its tiny body thrashing violently. With no escape from the rising heat, instinct took over. It clawed downward, seeking freedom in the only direction left, into the flesh of the victim. The screams that followed were unlike any other. The rat's sharp claws tore through skin, its teeth gnawing, driven by blind terror. The prisoner writhed against the straps, his body twisting in agony, but the device allowed no release. The torment was drawn out, inch by inch, bite by bite. Some victims fainted from the pain only to be revived with cold water, so the horror could continue. Others begged for death long before it came. Domitian rarely looked away. Where others might recoil, he studied the process with unsettling calm. To him, this was not savagery, it was control. Each scream reminded the onlookers that their lives hung by a thread of loyalty. Each drop of blood etched fear into the hearts of those who might have dared to oppose him. Some accounts suggest he even smiled on occasion, though never broadly. His satisfaction was subtle, the tightening of his jaw, the narrowing of his eyes, a quiet nod when the victim's final cries fell silent. For Domitian, cruelty was art, and this particular method, with its mix of ingenuity and terror, was his masterpiece. News of the rat torture spread beyond the palace walls. Though executions and public punishments were nothing new to Rome, this method unsettled even the hardened citizens. Crucifixions, maulings by lions, even burning at the stake. These were brutal but expected. They belonged to the theater of Roman justice. But rat torture was different. It was not a spectacle for the masses in the Colosseum. It was a whispered horror, carried through taverns and marketplaces. The very secrecy of it made it more terrifying. Parents warned their children never to speak against the emperor. Senators weighed every word as if it could cost them their lives. The fear spread like poison, deeper than any sword could pierce. Domitian's use of rat torture reveals not only his cruelty, but also his understanding of human psychology. He knew that fear of death was powerful, but fear of how one might die was greater still. It was not enough to execute. He needed to create the anticipation of unimaginable agony. By choosing a method so grotesque, he ensured that even rumors carried the weight of terror. A senator did not have to see the punishment firsthand to dread it. A whisper of the rat pot was enough to bend a man's will. In this way, Domitian turned cruelty into politics. Torture became not merely a punishment, but a form of governance. Rome was ruled not by the Senate, nor by the legions, but by fear alone. Among the stories whispered through history, one account stands out. A young noble, accused of conspiring with generals to overthrow the emperor, was dragged before Domitian. He was handsome, respected, and known for his eloquence in the Senate. His trial was brief little more than accusation and condemnation. When the pot was strapped against his stomach, the noble maintained a facade of defiance. He shouted that Rome would not endure tyranny forever, that the emperor would fall like all despots before him. But his courage shattered with the first shriek of the rat inside the heated vessel. His body convulsed, his voice breaking into panicked screams. Witnesses said his cries echoed for hours in the marble halls, long after his body was carried away. For Domitian, this was victory. Not merely the silencing of an enemy, but the public breaking of a man's spirit. Yet with each act of cruelty, resentment festered. Senators, once cowed into silence, began to meet in secret. Generals, weary of suspicion, whispered their frustrations in campfires along the frontiers. Even palace servants, who carried out the emperor's orders, shivered in private at the memory of screams they could not forget. Domitian's reign was stable in appearance, but beneath the marble floors of Rome, cracks widened. His cruelty had kept rebellion at bay, but it also ensured that when rebellion came, it would strike with fury. As the years passed, Domitian's paranoia deepened. He relied increasingly on spies, punishing not just deeds but words, even thoughts suspected of disloyalty. And the rat torture became more frequent, its grotesque reputation spreading like a curse over the city. But cruelty, like fire, consumes all in time. Domitian did not realize that each scream he demanded, each life broken by his twisted methods, pushed Rome closer to betrayal. For while fear can rule for a season, it cannot rule forever. And in the shadows, those who had lost friends, brothers, and sons to the emperor's cruelty were already plotting his end. The marble halls of Domitian's palace grew quieter with each passing year, not because the emperor demanded silence, but because fear itself muted voices. Senators spoke in whispers, soldiers lowered their eyes, and servants carried out their duties with trembling hands. Rome still glittered on the surface, yet beneath, hatred for the emperor boiled like molten rock waiting to erupt. Domitian believed himself untouchable. He surrounded himself with guards, demanded daily reports from spies, and even had the walls of his palace lined with polished stone, so he could catch reflections of anyone approaching from behind. But paranoia cannot shield a tyrant forever. The cruelty that had held Rome in check was the same cruelty that inspired his downfall. The final conspiracy took root in the heart of his own household. Court officials, senators, and even members of his guard, weary of endless executions and the grotesque spectacles of rat torture, resolved that the empire could no longer endure his reign. The whispers turned to plans, and the plans turned to daggers. On September 18th, 96 AD, the plot was carried out. Domitian entered his chambers, unaware that the end of his rule had arrived. A servant handed him a document with false accusations, distracting him as the conspirators moved in. The first blow came from behind a dagger plunging into flesh. The emperor fought back fiercely, for he was strong even at 44, but the numbers overwhelmed him. Steel pierced again and again, until the man who had called himself Lord and God collapsed on the marble floor. The tyrant of Rome was dead. When the news spread, the Senate wasted no time. Relief swept through the chambers as senators denounced his memory. Statues of Domitian were torn down, his name scratched from inscriptions, his rule condemned as tyranny. What he had built through fear crumbled in a single day, erased by the same people who had once bowed trembling before him. Yet even in death, Domitian's cruelty lingered. The stories of his punishments, especially the rat torture, remain etched in Rome's collective memory. Parents still frighten their children with whispers of the clay pot and the gnawing rat. Historians, both Roman and later, recalled not only the emperor's paranoia and brutality, but the grotesque ingenuity of his chosen methods. Domitian's reign had brought stability to Rome's borders and order to its economy, but such achievements were overshadowed by the cruelty that defined his rule. He had sought to govern through fear, to wield torture as both punishment and warning. And though his empire outlasted him, his name became forever tied to the image of a rat clawing its way through human flesh. History remembers many emperors, some for greatness, others for folly. But Domitian endures as a symbol of how power, when poised by paranoia, can twist into monstrosity. His end came not from foreign enemies or grand battles, but from those closest to him, who could no longer bear to live under the shadow of his cruelty. The rat torture of Domitian was more than a punishment. It was the embodiment of a reign built on fear. And just as every victim eventually broke beneath it, so too did the emperor himself. You can subscribe to the channel for more interesting content like this.